Michael Saylor's Bitcoin strategy paid off big time. MicroStrategy used to be an underperformer within the Nasdaq 100. Once Michael Saylor bought Bitcoin, things turned around rather quickly. Now the big question is, does it make sense to buy MSTR over Bitcoin? How does MicroStrategy stock perform relative to Bitcoin? How is it currently valued? Does it make sense? Is it likely that MicroStrategy is not just going to outperform the Nasdaq 100, but also Bitcoin? Now let's have a look at a few charts you've probably never seen before. So first of all, we've got MSTR stock over here, and this vertical line is when MicroStrategy started purchasing Bitcoin. And so this seems to be an obvious case. The stock went up by roughly 10x since the purchase. Michael Saylor is a happy man. Now let's compare a few things. What we've got over here is the S&P 500 relative to the Nasdaq 100. So since 1985 to today, general stocks underperformed tech stocks by 80%. The crash we see over here was the dot-com bubble. So this is when tech stocks outperformed very quickly. Then tech stocks crashed. The S&P 500 gained, relatively speaking, but over the long term, we do see growth stocks do outgrow other stocks. And so when we make now this comparison of MicroStrategy relative to the Nasdaq 100, then we are already setting the bar quite high because again, technology stocks tend to be outperformers. Now, since purchase of Bitcoin, MicroStrategy was able to outperform the rest of technology by almost 6x. And let's zoom out a little bit. Before MicroStrategy started buying Bitcoin, it was one of the many poor performers, an underperformance of 80% versus the Nasdaq 100. Now this is actually very typical. This can be seen in pretty much any market, but especially in technology. The returns are very much concentrated in a few players. So in other words, some companies outperform massively and the vast majority underperform. So when you take an average of all of this, you get the Nasdaq 100. If you just randomly pick a stock within the Nasdaq 100, you've got an almost 80% chance of doing worse than the index. In other words, if you ever consider buying an individual stock, you need to have a very high threshold because you need to pick the top 20% in order to outperform. If you do not expect your stock to outperform the vast majority of companies, then you probably have a loser at your hand. And then probably you should simply just buy an index ETF. And so what we see here in those 20 years, an underperformance of 4 percentage points every single year. That's actually not that atypical. It's actually very, very common. But we do see how the purchase of Bitcoin increased volatility, but also helped MicroStrategy to finally outperform. But here comes the big question. Does it make sense to buy MicroStrategy over Bitcoin? Because now with all of those Bitcoins on the balance sheet, it's probably not that much of a question. Should I buy Alphabet or should I buy Google or Facebook instead of MicroStrategy? It's rather the question, what should I do with the really risk-on assets? And to answer that question, let's have a look at MicroStrategy relative to Bitcoin. Of course, initially, Bitcoin had a meteoric rise, and so MicroStrategy underperformed Bitcoin a lot. But then, since purchase of Bitcoin, MicroStrategy goes somewhat in sync with the leading cryptocurrency. And there seems to be somewhat of a trading range. Now, interestingly enough, that range is quite large in magnitude. From top to bottom, we see an almost 80% drop, or if we turn this around, from bottom to top, an almost 400% increase. And so one has to wonder, is it really justified that MicroStrategy stock gained against Bitcoin by almost 4x since the middle of May 2022. The middle of May 2022 was over here when Bitcoin was at 30K. Since then, Bitcoin doubled. But MicroStrategy stock didn't just double, it went up by 700%. It also does not appear as if MicroStrategy is just a levered version on Bitcoin, right? Because Bitcoin itself went down from May of 2022 to the end of 2022. But MicroStrategy stock barely lost, just 20% versus 45% for Bitcoin. So really, there seems to be something idiosyncratic going on. It seems to make sense to sell MicroStrategy when it's very expensive relative to Bitcoin and to buy it when it's very cheap relative to Bitcoin. It's not just the Bitcoin price that's moving the MSTR price. And right now, unfortunately, we are not very cheap relative to Bitcoin. The potential downside is maybe 60%. 80%, or in the worst case, 74%, the potential upside is maybe only 21%. So I believe it makes sense to rather buy now the Bitcoin ETFs by the BlackRocks of this world than to buy MSTR. But that can, of course, change at any point in time in the future. I expect this to change at some point. And once it does change, I will definitely also make an update video on this channel. So feel free to subscribe. I publish videos regularly. Feel free to also give this a like. It helps the channel grow. If you've got Telegram, feel free to join us as well. The link is down below. Looking very much forward to chatting with you.